And everyone would hate me.
Nobody could ever hate you.
Joffrey does.
Sansa Stark. Some people adore her as a character, some people despise her. Hopefully we can all understand her, because I think she's fascinating, perhaps one of the most psychologically interesting characters in all the books A Song of Ice and Fire. That makes this both a very fun and a very long video to make. Sansa Stark begins the book as an 11-year-old girl of Ned and Catelyn Stark. She is the second eldest sibling, if you exclude Jon Snow, and the eldest sister above Arya. She was betrothed to marry Joffrey, and spoilers, everything went wrong. She realised Joffrey was much less than a romanticised prince. She lived as a hostage under the Lannisters. She was forcibly married to Tyrion Lannister and eventually escaped to the Eyrie with Littlefinger. Pretending to be Littlefinger's illegitimate daughter named Elaine Stone, she has somewhat helped him to secure the Eyrie, somewhat had, an interesting relationship with Robert or Robin Arryn, and is set the stage to try and seduce Harry the Heir. That is as far as the books got before we all have to wait 2 billion years for George R.R. Martin his corpse to be resurrected in order to finish these books. I don't know. There's your summary though. I am a psychodynamic counsellor and psychotherapist. We are going to attempt to analyse Sansa with the important disclaimer that doing this is a very flawed and doomed pursuit. You can't accurately analyse someone who is fictional, someone you can't even talk to. You wouldn't really do this stuff in reality anyway. However, this is still a great exercise and experience in empathy in trying to understand, and there's still a lot we can take away from this attempt. The stories are deliberately open to interpretation, so as ever it is good to hear in the comments what you think I got wrong, or only considered one side of, or missed out, or completely forgot to mention. That happens more than you'd think, probably even in a video this long. With that out of the way though, let's just get going. Can we understand Sansa Stark from Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire? Where better to start than with a discussion of her siblings? Sansa is the second eldest, and the most similar to her mother Catelyn Stark in both appearance and personality. I've made videos on both her parents before if you're interested, but I think Sansa's first chapter tells us a lot about her, and whilst I know a lot of people find it boring or find early Sansa annoying, in my opinion, her first chapter in A Game of Thrones is one of my favourite chapters from any of the books. It's such a sweet, supremely underrated chapter that perfectly sets out the perspective of a child. Being a children's counsellor, I would say that, yes, but it's still great, and for one, it makes it immediately apparent that Sansa is attempting to emulate both her mother and, I think, Septa Mordane, as is quite common for any child, particularly eldest children. Although, again, Robb is the eldest, he has his clear role and pressure to grow into the Lord of Winterfell, but Sansa is the eldest girl with different expectations and seeking different approval to be a lady. Naturally, she's trying to emulate her two clear female role models in Catelyn and Septa Mordane. This is what kids do, and I find it sweet seeing her attempting to be like them, but not quite getting it right, because yeah, she's still a kid. She has her ideas of what a lady is, how a mum or Septa Mordane behave from her perspective, but they're just ideas, and so it all goes a bit wrong in her interactions with Arya, and that frustrates her. "You have to come with me," she told her sister firmly. "You can't refuse the Queen. Septa Mordane will expect you." Arya ignored her. She gave a hard yank with the brush. Nymeria growled and spun away, affronted. "Come back here!" "There's going to be lemon cakes and tea," Sansa went on, all adult and reasonable. "Why would you want to ride a smelly old horse and get all sore and sweaty when you could recline on feather pillows and eat cakes with the Queen?" "I don't like the Queen," Arya said casually. Sansa sucked in her breath, shocked that even Arya would say such a thing. You see her trying so hard to be firm and parental and persuasive in that childlike sort of way. It's so interesting to compare these moments against the way she later tries persuading Robin when she's in the Eyrie, but their little squabble goes on until this. "Gods be true, Arya, sometimes you act like such a child," Sansa said. "I'll go by myself then. It'll be ever so much nicer that way. Lady and I will eat all the lemon cakes and just have the best time without you." It's such a fun, sweet irony that, you know, Sansa calling Arya a child when she is just as much one. You can feel George, I think, having so much fun with this chapter. I know this is the kind of stuff that do make people turn their noses up at Sansa and call her snobby, but I find it such a sweet, typically childish thing to do. She's behaving how she thinks she's supposed to behave, and let's not forget Arya technically looks down on Sansa just as much as Sansa does her, but there are other things going on here we'll get to in a moment. In the words of Tyrion though, Sansa is nothing but dutiful, and that makes sense, right? I've already discussed in Catelyn's video just how very dutiful she had to be growing up in her circumstances. It then makes sense as the eldest raised by Catelyn for a lot of similar expectations to be placed onto Sansa, to be good and dutiful and obedient, for which she tries very, very hard to be as much like a lady, as much like her mother as possible. Although the mention of obedience there is interesting, because dutiful and obedient are not the same things. Does Sansa understand the distinction in the beginning of the books? Maybe in concept, sure, but the Tarly words are family, duty, honour. She has been taught about a lady's duty to her lord. She is a young, insecure girl who is very eager for the approval of her elders, and that could lead you down a path of obedience. I think most of the Stark children's stories are about finding their identities. Sansa is a young girl who doesn't yet know who she is, therefore she clings on tight to the clearest, most tangible concept she has about her identity, which is being a lady. She literally names her direwolf that. Sansa tries very, very hard to be that, to make that her personality, until eventually she realises it's too vague a concept to be, it's too flawed. It can't be the encapsulation of any person, she just can't be that ideal, she isn't, she doesn't want to be. But it takes her time to learn that. Sometimes you first have to embrace a thing. Chew the fat and spit out the gristle is what my supervisor used to say. Absorb yourself in all of it and then slowly spit out the bits that don't fit with who you figure out you are. Is that enough to explain why Sansa is so eager to be dutiful and to find approval? I mean, Catelyn was never exactly keen to be dutiful the way Sansa is. You know, it was a burden thrown onto her growing up, and she wore that badge because she had to. It's entirely possible Catelyn regaled Sansa with stories of all of her duties growing up and all the things she had to do, and that's rubbed off on Sansa, but could we say Sansa is just so very eager because that's part of the trope her character is used to pick apart? Because it's a big theme to explore in the books. Can we say it's because Sansa is caught up in the social pressures imposed on her the way any vulnerable child might be? Yeah, I'd say yes. But I also think sibling rivalry comes into this. As I've discussed before, siblings can exaggerate their differences as a means to be seen as unique, as their own person. Much easier to compete for your parents' attention when you're seen in different ways for different things, you know, when you're not in a direct competition. Sansa is born into a family where there's Robb and Jon above her doing boyish things and being trained with the sword. When a sister comes along, Sansa hopes it'll be someone to join in her more ladylike games, only no, Arya wants to ride and fight and isn't much good at needlework. So being a lady is actually what makes Sansa stand out in a family. Plus, it's the thing social pressure suggests she's supposed to be good at. Leaning into it further then makes sense, and especially when that's compared against Arya. No doubt that then makes Sansa feel good about herself, to be the good sister of the family. That could be a sense of validation. I am the good one, where Arya sucks at needlework and is always covered in mud. That's a pleasant little interpretation that strokes your ego at an age where you are insecure and want to feel good at something. And this is being a lady, I think, half inspired by her interest in songs and the fact she's in an environment that's cut off from her bigger political responsibilities. Living way up in the north after a golden age of peace with two parents who I think are quite happy to shelter their children from the political machinations of the south, just as Ned tried to remove himself from that nest of vipers. So Sansa A has grown up keen to be a lady, B hasn't been taught the subtle political side of a lady's position, and C, being good becomes a way for Sansa to stand out in her family, especially compared to a more adventurous sister. This video is likely to be a bit haphazard and all over the place as we try to settle into it. Something else in the first chapter though is how lonely Sansa appears. That's what makes a lot of it so sweet to me. She talks of Arya's ability to make friends with everybody. Arya befriends Micah the Butcher's Boy. She talks to men-at-arms, free riders, Jory Cassell, anyone that strikes her as interesting, which means anyone who isn't in that courtly world of ladies. Arya is adventurous, refuses to be constrained, and is brilliant at connecting with people from all walks of life. Sansa though? Sansa doesn't really know how to connect beyond her strict sets of highborn people, for which I think she does so readily fall back upon courtesy and sweet words she's been taught to sing, as the Hound puts it. You know, don't get me wrong, she's not isolated. All the Stark children interacted and played games with each other. Arya and Sansa didn't truly hate each other, however Sansa is definitely more cut off, and has a lot less variety to the different types of people she interacts with. There seems a greater limit to the amount of visitors they get up in Winterfell, and for female company we generally have Catelyn when Catelyn isn't busy, Septa Mordain, and Jane Poole when Jane is permitted. I love her relationship with Jane, and I wish it had properly been in the show, but even there I think the difference in social standing can affect things for Sansa. Whether it's feeling restrained, feeling a lack of confidence, or seeing that stuff as Arya's thing, I do get the sense Sansa ends up more isolated and possibly lonely than her sister, for which that haughty nature that many children do show at times I think becomes Sansa's defense. You know, either she sees Arya getting on super well with anyone easily. She even sees Jon and Robb and later Theon being this clique who are taught to fight and hunt and all of that together. Sansa of course does get her friend in Jane Poole, but you can't help feeling like Jane Poole's been given to become Sansa's friend specifically because she doesn't have many others. So either Sansa envies this about Arya, which is a painful feeling, or she tries to spare herself that pain by concluding, well, I don't want that anyway, that's all wild, lower class stuff. I'm not jealous, I'm just on a level above it. Who wants to ride on a smelly horse when I've got lemon cakes with the Queen? Arya would make friends with anybody. This Micah was the worst. A butcher's boy, 13 and wild. He slept in the meat wagon and smelled of the slaughtering block. Just the sight of him was enough to make Sansa feel sick. But Arya seemed to prefer his company to hers. This is what I love about her characterization. I think it would be easy to conclude Sansa is a bit conceited or stuck up, is what people often say. Not that they're wrong, or that those feelings are particularly uncommon for a child, but you can see the insecurity behind it. Arya seemed to prefer Micah's company to hers. Why not me? What has a smelly butcher got above me? George had the sense to write that in. It's a fun irony, because technically Arya is the odd one out in the family, or Jon. Sansa is the most correct, let's say, and yet from a different point of view she's the one who least belongs. I think the fact it feels like both of those things is part of what makes it confusing for her. And by the way, I know being a little bit superior is like the worst of all sins a fictional character could partake in. People always seem to hate that more than anything else, but the majority of characters in Westeros are a bit superior because the vast majority of characters are highborn. This is part of the culture George is picking apart. Even the good Jon Snow needed advice to tone it down, to stop acting so above all the others at the Night's Watch. It isn't an endearing trait, no, it naturally gets people's backs up, but we can understand where it comes from. It doesn't necessarily make someone a bad person. I think hating Sansa for being a bit superior is pretty extreme. When Arya rejects Sansa's offer to visit the Queen with her, Sansa is quoted as feeling alone and humiliated. Sansa took the long way back to the inn, where she knew Septa Mordain would be waiting. Lady padded quietly beside her. She was almost in tears. Sansa feels rejected. She wanted to go to this event with her sister, but she also struggles to just say, please come with me, I don't want to be alone. She tries to draw on parental authority, then on persuasion, and neither works. She feels like her sister prefers butcher's boys, horses, muds, anyone, anything to spending time with Sansa. Not that we can say for certain Sansa actually wanted to go with Arya, but I imagine that feeling is nestled there a little less consciously. Sansa definitely doesn't want to go on her own. I think she's nervous. I think she even knows Arya is good at talking. I think she's aware on a social level that it looks bad if only one of them accepts the Queen's invitation, and that's a problem when Sansa is keen to make a good impression and win the Queen's approval. I think she also feels pressure as the eldest sister to be an example for Arya, to rein her in as well, so I think failing to convince Arya to come along feels humiliating to Sansa in the sense like she is failing to emulate Catelyn or Septa Mordane well enough to win their approval. At the absolute least, Sansa would like her sister to want to spend some time with her. Feeling rejected, Sansa also rejects Arya's interests, and then Arya does the same in return until the two end up in a cycle, both half wanting to connect with each other whilst also keen to resist the other and reassert just how very opposite they both are. So generally, I think what all of that means is in Sansa we have a young and vulnerable girl unsure of her identity and pressured by social expectations for which she seeks approval and superiority as a defense against loneliness, that lack of security and feeling like the odd one out. Sibling rivalry exacerbates it, and all of this would ordinarily be fine. There's nothing too out of the ordinary here. Sansa would probably grow and develop. Her parents probably assumed she would have time to grow and develop. However, the 20 odd years of peace doesn't last forever. Sansa gets thrown into horrible circumstances at a time when she is most vulnerable, and it's really sad to see that happen because that eagerness for approval can be exploited. It's time we started getting into the meat of this video though. There's a big point to be made in relation to her father. However, I first do need to do something a little different. Long-term viewers may be surprised by this. So I got an interesting email from somebody named Leah. Hi there. We'd like to sponsor 2 videos on your YouTube channel, My Little Thought Tree. If you're interested, please let me know. I'll need to send you your mask. This is from Manta Sleep, the sleep mask company. Hi Leah. Thanks for reaching out. I can't lie, I've looked up your company just now and it does get me genuinely excited. I'm always really sensitive to light when sleeping. I've bought 4 different sleep masks in the past. 2 of them felt cheap. The other 2 worked well enough, but both had issues and both wore out over time. I had been planning to hunt for a really good sleep mask, so to suddenly have a company reach out offering sponsorship about sleep masks is either a bizarre sign or a nice coincidence. If you could let me know a little more about the company and what you're hoping for with me, that'd be great. We talked back and forth for a little bit. They let me pick a product to have posted to me so I could try it out. I just went for the Pro Mask because it's specifically designed for side sleeping. Hey Leah, hope you had a great holiday doing something nice. I've had the mask for 3 days now and I just wanted to say I love it. I didn't even realise until it arrived that you could rip off the eye cups with the Velcro and reposition them. I think that's such a great idea. It felt comfortable. I could blink and move my eyes inside the mask. It stayed in place. It blocked the light. I fell asleep. I waffled on and we ended up talking about scrubs for some reason, but I've only ever worked with 2 different brands on this channel because I only want to take on sponsorships from companies I genuinely have passion for. If you like the sound of Manta Sleep, there's a link in the description and as a pinned comment to get you 10% off any of their products. And if not, then yeah, we're getting back to the video now. Sansa is confused about Arya's behaviour. Arya does not do the good, dutiful things. Arya misbehaves to the despair of Septa Mordane, yes, but her parents, Ned especially, they seem to love her for it. That's got to feel bizarre. Sansa kept hoping he would tell Arya to behave herself and act like the highborn lady she was supposed to be, but he never did. He only hugged her and thanked her for the flowers. I don't know if Ned is actually closer to Arya than to Sansa, but I think that's definitely how Sansa feels. and it's hard to blame her for feeling that. Arya gets a dancing teacher where Sansa never gets the high harp lessons she wanted. That goes kind of forgotten. Ned is reluctant to go to the tourney with her, and above all, regardless how hard Sansa tries to be good and how bad Arya behaves, somehow Arya is loved just as much, if not more, and we might be able to understand the nuance here, but from Sansa's perspective, it would be frustrating. I'm the good one. I'm the one who does exactly as I'm supposed to. Why aren't I rewarded? I can't help wondering if the rivalry here feeds into Sansa's eagerness for approval and to be dutiful and to show up Arya even more. And then I think to feel angry at Ned when that doesn't work. In many ways, I think this is at the core of Sansa's downfall in Book 1. The motivation behind her decision to speak with the Queen and, cause a lot of things to go wrong. Some fans condemn Sansa as an absolute idiot and the worst person in existence for doing that. By no means will I argue it was an intelligent or good thing to do, because it was not, but I think there's more to it than just labelling her stupid or bad. From the very beginning, Sansa has an underlying frustration with her father, made worse by the fact she never properly manages to voice it, and Ned never truly speaks to her about it. She feels he favours Arya. Not only does she not get the harp lessons and he's reluctant to go to the tourney, but let's not forget Ned executes Sansa's direwolf lady. Sure, it was Cersei, or perhaps the king who ordered that. It was Joffrey who caused it. But the book tells us exactly why Sansa is reluctant to blame Joffrey. She's got to be betrothed to him. You don't want to see him as nasty if you're having to commit the rest of your life to him. But generally, Ned is her father. Ned is the one that's supposed to understand, is supposed to love and protect her, and yet Ned executed her direwolf, put his duty to the king ahead of his love for family. Or no, not family, ahead of Sansa specifically. That is no doubt how she feels here. And all throughout the book there are these unintended slights that Sansa feels like her dad is making towards her. And when you are young and insecure and you don't have as clear a perspective, you would worry about those things, you would see them as slights. You would wonder, why doesn't he love me as much? Why doesn't he support me? He lets Arya have whatever she wants. I try all the time to be good. What do I ever get? This feeling just building up and up in the back of her mind until suddenly Ned tells Sansa that she is no longer allowed the only thing she wants. The only other thing now that her direwolf is dead, which is to live in the south with Joffrey. No. I won't let you marry him. I'm sending you back to cold Winterfell where there aren't any singers who come and visit. And there aren't even all these different ladies and courts to attend. No, Sansa, you can't have that either. For Sansa to then visit the Queen and vent to her about this and hope Cersei will persuade Ned to change his mind. It is a short-sighted, childish act, but we can absolutely see where it comes from. Sansa feels like she's been unjustly punished again. The way she was punished by having her direwolf executed, even though she wasn't the one that caused the fight. Already feeling all of this pain and slight against her, already wondering if her dad doesn't love her, it makes her impulsive. It stops her from taking that moment to reflect enough and truly consider what her dad is doing and why. If she did take that moment, she could have understood. She's perfectly capable, but she didn't because she's too worked up. It creates a blind spot here. People, especially children, do this all the time. They fly right off the handle thinking the decisions made against them are personal, jumping to assumptions. And honestly, I think if you have to blame anyone for this, I don't think you should blame anyone, but if you do, I think it would be Ned. Ned sat down and had a very clear and realistic talk with Arya when she needed it. With Sansa, he doesn't go anywhere near far enough to make sure that Sansa understands, to properly embed the message, to make sure she has listened beyond impulsively leaping to conclusions. If Ned had explained further and let Sansa voice all of her frustration she has been feeling towards him this entire book, voiced it enough that Ned could respond and they could resolve it, perhaps this all would have gone differently. And yeah, If everyone is only as intelligent as their dumbest decisions, then everyone has an IQ of like 5. There's a fun little irony in how readily and impulsively people jump to the conclusion that Sansa is completely stupid and they hate her off the back of Sansa impulsively jumping to a conclusion about something. Sometimes smart people do incredibly stupid things, sometimes idiots do smart things, or maybe intelligence isn't as black and white as a person either being dumb or smart. Maybe we're all more complicated than that, unless you're named Victorian. Maybe we should mention Jon quickly, before we move on from discussing her family relationships. Jon is an interesting one because on the one hand, I think the way people talk about a rivalry between Jon and Sansa is massively overblown. Probably partly because of the show, and partly how quickly this mean girl prom queen kind of trope gets thrown upon her. You know, there's that scene in the show where Sansa apologises to Jon for being cruel to him when they were young, but I don't think there's really any evidence for that cruelty in either of Sansa or Jon's chapters. I don't even think they hate each other. I think they just don't feel much about each other at all. They're clearly not close, and there is coldness and perhaps some level of resentment, but I don't think there's cruelty or malice or being mean. In a lot of ways that makes sense. Catelyn does not like Jon. She tries not to directly be cruel to him. We only see that in a moment where she tells Jon it should have been him to fall from the tower. But mostly she's not explicit. It's rarely direct, but there is definitely underlying feeling of disdain and I think fear towards Jon from Catelyn. A very young, vulnerable Sansa who looks up to her mother, the closest of the family to Catelyn, right down to sharing the same gods. Sansa would pick up on that disdain, even before she was old enough to actually understand it. Would Sansa be left with a sense that there is some vague reason not to trust Jon, not to get too close, to feel some sense of a barrier? Maybe. Sansa is naturally the person who would have the least time to interact with Jon anyway, and perhaps then, again, feeling less close to him, her haughty defense of, well, I don't want to anyway, I'm above that, comes into play again. As total speculation, I think perhaps being so determinedly sticking to the rules of highborn society, Sansa might have felt she's meant to keep a distance to bastards, meant to act above them. Maybe. I mean, she doesn't feel that way towards Jane Poole. All of that could be conjecture, some of it could be conjecture, it could be true. The counter argument, of course, is how incredibly interesting it is when we get to Sansa's final chapter in A Feast for Crows. The last non-sample chapter we have of her. Mention is made there of a new Night's Watch Lord Commander. Sansa realises it must be Jon, and then she thinks, she had not thought of Jon in ages. Someone or other pointed this out to me in the comments once. Why has she not thought of Jon in ages? Like, sure, she mentions it would be sweet to see Jon again, and we see more maturity and free thinking here, but Sansa has been spending forever disguised as a bastard girl named Elaine Stone. She has been experiencing highborn society from the perspective of a bastard, and yet not once has she thought of the bastard she grew up with named Jon Snow? It is odd. You'd think there would be some big reflective moment where her life as Elaine changes her perspective on Jon, but you never get that. And on the one hand, this supports the idea that she doesn't hate him, because I reckon she would think about a person she hated. However, I don't know why she doesn't think about him at all. Does this suggest there's something about their relationship that George is yet to reveal? Is it a reflection of Sansa's struggles with memory? Does she not think of him until now because she feels guilty that she wasn't closer to him? Is it evading something uncomfortable? Did George have more technical reasons for not wanting Jon to be mentioned in her chapters earlier? I don't know. And because I don't know, I'm not going to dwell on this point when there are so many other big things we need to get into discussing. I'll just say, if you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments because I am really intrigued. I think we all know Sansa has a bit of an obsession with songs and stories of knights and fair maids and all of that. A lot of you might immediately be thinking of dissociation here, which, yes, I think that's probably accurate. Sansa's need for beauty and song-like life clearly functions as a defense. We will get into that, but it's also worth saying it's not just that, you know? It's good to not just see a person's defences as some bad thing that's holding them back and needs to be dropped. One, because that fails to recognise how sometimes people need these defences as a thing of psychic survival, and also sometimes there are many good aspects to them too. Things are rarely just either good or bad. Okay, first we have to point out thematically George wrote all of that in for the sake of picking apart the trope. Much of A Song of Ice and Fire is deconstructing classic ideals of fantasy and contrasting Sansa's obsession with fairy tales with a more brutal reality is a great way to explore that. Yes, but this is about considering these fictional people as though they were real, despite how flawed that can be. And I think how greatly Sansa's parents shielded her from the world plays into this naivety. Ned didn't expect to die and leave her a captive to the Lannisters. He didn't even expect to ride south until Robert came calling. Ideally, Sansa would have been in Winterfell until an age where she was becoming more sure of her identity and more understanding of the world. Sansa is also particularly sheltered amongst the children, I think. One being a girl, two being less interested in all the things Rob and Jon are learning from Ned, and three, Ned being less effective at knowing how to communicate with Sansa. And maybe four, how incredibly rigid Septa Mordane is. But there's also the fact, of course, Sansa is into fairy tales. What the hell else is Sansa supposed to do with her time? She's the girly one. She sticks to ladylike things, and when Jane is her only friend who is arguably even more into songs than Sansa, what else is there for a girl to obsess over when you're stuck in the frozen north? We all have our imaginations and we all explore them in different ways. I don't know if this is correct either. I feel like this might just be my brain running off on what feels most familiar from the show, but I feel like most of the northern fairy tales in Westeros are to do with darker things like giants and white walkers and, well, not all dark things, but less beautiful things compared to all the southern stories of knights and fair maidens. Am I wrong there? I don't know. Would she naturally dream of warmer, more beautiful climates and all those things she comes to associate with an idealised south? Yes. There's even a quote about the fact all the singers seem to come from the south and they rarely travel north. Therefore the south could have been idealised in her head, and finally then getting to travel south, she may have very desperately wanted her adventure to live up to that idealisation, and therefore be keen to turn a blind eye to the things that then don't live up to it. All her life she's wanted to travel south. For it to not be wonderful would be crushing. Also, she was travelling south to get married, breaking away from the family, the way children might start to think about that at her age. How all these different feelings might tie into some idealised, beautiful vision of the world. We all have wishful ideas about wonderful adventures. Fortunately, most of us don't have to face an extreme and horrific version of those adventures playing out in reality. Sansa does. Children in particular often aren't very good at understanding the nuance between things being both good and bad. They do tend to split life into black and white categories, sometimes just in very small moments, like your mum shouts at you and for a moment you suddenly feel like she might hate you, or she buys you something nice and for a second you feel like the most loved person in the world. We can notice early Arya technically also splits the world into very black and white ways between dumb ladylike things and fun adventure things, and she kind of has to grow beyond that. Learning complexity takes time for a child, and particularly when you're under a lot of stress, this kind of splitting gets used a lot more. Categories that are meant to be a bit vague and nuanced suddenly become very rigid because the world feels less scary that way, more understandable if you can just order it into distinct boxes. I think all of this is true for the way Sansa expects things to either be beautiful and song-like and perfect, or something ugly that spoils the beauty of things. She often says about things or people spoiling or ruining the beauty, like it was there, whatever moment was the perfect moment, and it could have carried on being perfect, only something had to spoil it. Often that something is Arya. It's funny because if reality does keep falling short of the idealised beauty, that should be an indication to Sansa that, you know, maybe life isn't actually that perfect. And in a way, you do see her gradually discovering that, but at the same time, she also falls into the trap of thinking, well, it would be perfect, it should be, It's just this one specific thing, or this one specific person who happens to get in the way of perfection. And that thinking is part of the defense. It's her not wanting to let go of the idealization. She wants to hold it tight. It gives her hope and purpose and comforts her. She doesn't want to say, actually, nothing is ever perfect, the world is bleak, nor does she want to get mad at herself for being naive, or at the entire world for being so flawed, so she gets mad instead at one clear target, the one specific thing that stopped life being perfect, you know? That way there's still hope it could be in the future. Life can still be a song, I just need to shut out all of the bad bits. Arya had a way of ruining everything. She tries to spoil everything, father. She can't stand for anything to be beautiful or nice or splendid. And you can see in just that how much projection there is and how already suitable the defense mechanism of dissociation could be for someone like Sansa. You can very naturally see how this stuff could get pushed to more extreme levels once she's under more extreme stress and trauma. Largely, I reckon we could say trauma turns all of this stuff from a child's natural struggle to slowly learn complexity instead into a rigid defense that often falls into dissociation. That's kind of the tragedy with Sansa. I've talked about dissociation in other videos, so I won't repeat a big explanation of what it is other than to quickly say it's kind of disconnecting from your thoughts and experiences. There are different kinds of dissociation and these things tend to work on a bit of a spectrum, but fairy tales and beautiful songs come to work for Sansa as a means to disconnect from the reality of where she is. To turn reality into a song, I guess, to see only the beauty. Either she's kidding herself into seeing things as perfect, the way she does Joffrey initially. Joffrey was the soul of courtesy. He talked to Sansa all night, showering her with compliments, making her laugh, sharing little bits of court gossip, explaining Moonboy's japes. Sansa did not really know Joffrey yet, but she was already in love with him. And if a moment or a person is so unbeautiful, so ugly, that's the word, that she can't kid herself about it, they become the target. They're the thing that has spoiled the otherwise perfect moment. Or even more so, they sometimes become the target that is defeated. You know, the monsters are still part of the wonderful fairy tales. They exist to be defeated, so if Sansa sees the Hound and thinks he's ugly and scary, but then handsome Joffrey comes along and tells the hounds to go away, that's like a shining knight slaying the monster and saving the damsel in distress, you know? The Hound being scary here is framed like a monster that the beauty defeats, because beauty is always supposed to prevail in the songs. If she can, Sansa frames the ugliness like that. If she can't, because the beauty doesn't seem to win, then she finds a clear target who spoiled the moment, who stopped the music, who interrupted the song. Early on we see Joffrey turn from the wonderful, courteous person who walked with Sansa by the lake into the horrible man who was swearing and attacking her sister. Joffrey slashed at Arya with his sword, screaming obscenities, terrible words, filthy words. Quotes like that tell you she is not blind to Joffrey's behaviour. She also calls for both of them, Arya and Joffrey, to stop it. The problem is how she then interprets what happened. The chapter finishes with a look from Joffrey. His eyes snapped open and looked at her, and there was nothing but loathing there, nothing but the vilest contempt. "Then go!" he spit at her. "And don't touch me!" Perhaps quite similar to the look Cersei once described Tywin having in his eyes, by the way. It's a difficult thought for a child. How the hell did someone who seemed so nice, someone that helped me kid myself with ideas of perfection and beauty, how the hell did they suddenly turn so nasty? And there's a lot of conclusions Sansa might make here. One is that Joffrey is just nasty, that his earlier courtesy was a trick, but that's quite an uncomfortable thought when this is the person you're betrothed to, and you've also forever dreamt about visiting the south and getting to marry a prince as something magical. You know, you don't want to give that hope up too easily. Another conclusion is that he turns nasty because Joffrey hates her, that he meant that look of contempt, the one that hits her soul and makes her want to shrivel up. Perhaps he turns nasty because Sansa made him feel like that, because she displeased him. Perhaps maybe she even deserved that look of contempt. I do think she has that fear to a degree here, but thirdly, perhaps Arya made him turn nasty. That one sounds the most logical, right? Joffrey was behaving beautifully and then suddenly he switched when Arya appeared. Her unladylike sister suddenly made her prince turn unprincely. In reality, I think Sansa would feel all three of those interpretations, and probably others too, but the third one is largely the one she settles for as the one that aligns best with her worldview, and I think what's tragic is 2 points here. One brings us back to when I mentioned the idea of life would be perfect if only I shut out all the bad bits. Plus this utter look of contempt that makes Sansa feel shame and like it's all her fault. There's a very difficult mindset you can get trapped into there within abusive relationships, where you might start to hope my partner isn't really abusive, it's just when I get things wrong or something happens that upsets him. He's not a monster, it's just other external things turn him into that for a short moment. If only I can never get anything wrong again, then he won't become that monster, then he will love me the way I once believed he did. It's all my fault. Which, of course, it isn't Sansa's fault. But this is something people can be made to internalise, and that's why it's so difficult, especially when you're 11 years old. Admittedly, that's not quite the dynamic we get with her and Joffrey, but I think it's still relevant to mention because as the story goes on, Sansa does start to feel things are her fault and to consider herself stupid, useless. Everyone tells her she is anyway, so why not believe it? I think much of Sansa's internal conflict in the books is that the more trauma she experiences, the more she is caught between either wanting to escape into idealised beauty as a defence against the trauma, or at the same time trying to recognise the reality of the world, or at least of her situation. So on the one hand, she's trying to focus on the splendour of the tourney instead of her feelings about Lady. Although I think her grief does seep through in that chapter when she sees the dead knight. Sansa sat with her hands in her lap, watching with a strange fascination. She had never seen a man die before. She ought to be crying too, she thought, but the tears would not come. Well, you could interpret that line a lot of different ways, to be fair, but there's lots of Sansa being very invested in the beautiful shining knights as a symbol, and her becoming frustrated when they don't win things. Like the fact Soloris doesn't get to ride out to deal with the Riverlands. Sansa's internal defences make her unable to consider this from a political perspective, despite her being more than intelligent enough. No, she thinks father must have got it wrong. Of course the Shining Knight is meant to ride out and defeat the monster. He must have got it wrong because his leg is hurting him. It hurts him ever so much. It makes him cross. Otherwise, I'm certain he would have sent Soloris. This isn't stupidity exactly. This is her perception being warped or clouded by her internal world. This is her need to see life as a song. Another interesting example is the Hound winning his jousts and then eventually the entire tourney. At first, Sansa doesn't want him to win because he's obviously the monster, and if life is split between good and bad, between knights and monsters, then the Hound isn't supposed to win. Except he does. For which Sansa might have been very upset and argued the Hound spoiled it, and all that kind of stuff again. However, here she makes an interesting interpretation. It's a great example of the conflict between wanting to escape into beauty and attempting to compromise on her song in order to accept reality, because here she finds a midway between the song and reality by deciding, well, maybe the Hound isn't the monster. Maybe Sir Gregor is, not him. I think the Hound generally functions to challenge Sansa's worldview. Is the Hound a good person? Is he not? What if knights don't all look like knights on the outside? In which case, what if monsters don't all look like monsters? Worst of all, what if the good knights don't win like they do in the songs? What if the monsters win? That is a conclusion she falls into at one point while suffering under Joffrey. Let's take a moment to explore that. In life, the monsters win, she told herself. This is such a great beat in her arc, believing the monsters win. Everything turns horrible, everyone is killed, Joffrey turns cruel, father dies, everything is so awful then that you can't easily believe in the song anymore. However, it's also been your defense, you don't want to let it go, it's helped you cope, so Sansa reverses it. In life, the monsters win, that's still the song, it's still the same stories of knights and monsters, it's just the ending is reversed so that the monsters win instead of the knights, you know? They're still the same rigid worldview that things adhere to, just flipped on its head. That's such intelligent writing, I love it. It's very dangerous to conclude the monsters always win though. I think in terms of everything she's been put through, no wonder she decides that. Who can blame her? However, I think it risks starting her on a descent into becoming Cersei 2.0, into seeing all life as horrible and therefore why bother fighting it? Why bother nurturing and protecting those who are young and full of hope and still believe in beauty? No, project shame onto the younger, more innocent who still might believe. That's exactly what Cersei does to Sansa. Shames and mocks her for being naive, hopeful. Calls her a stupid, silly little girl. So does Joffrey, so does the Hound. There is a very real threat of Sansa letting go of all hope, deciding it is just the thoughts of a stupid, silly little girl, hating herself for being like that, and then hating anyone else who is like that too. During the Battle of Blackwater, Cersei seeks a level of pleasure in kind of corrupting Sansa and breaking her faith in the world. What if Sansa would start doing the same to others? Well, to answer that question, we do get moments in the books where Sansa interacts with others who are a bit naive and song-like, let's say. The way Sansa began the books. For one, there's Tommen, who Sansa is consistently kind and empathetic towards. At the start of the second book, Tommen wants to joust at the tourney for Joffrey's name day, but he's young and he's not very good, so he jousts against a straw man and loses. Joffrey finds it hilarious, but Sansa risks infuriating Joffrey to tell him that he should encourage Tommen, will him to get up and try again, tell him how well he rode. It's a really interesting moment when you think about it symbolically. This is the beginning of the book, when Sansa has seen her father die and a lot of her song-like belief has been stripped back. Telling Tommen how well he rode is a lie. It is just as much a rosy perspective as the song, yet Sansa doesn't look down on Tommen as pathetic or naive for thinking he could do well. She wants to nurture him. Even she knows it's a lie when she knows reality isn't like that. Tommen rode terribly, but she thinks preserving his belief in that lie would encourage him to try again and grow and get better until such a time where maybe he was good, where it wasn't a lie. Hold that thought, we'll return again in a moment. There are other occasions where Sansa encounters people who are more naive, or at least less experienced with the horrors of Westeros, and don't get me wrong, you do see a conflict here. Part of her does want to look down on them, part of her is even jealous, but she never quite wants to break their innocence the way Cersei tries to break hers. Sansa is made to feel about herself that she's a silly, pathetic little girl, but when she sees others she might project that same feeling onto, generally she doesn't treat them with the same coldness. Sansa maintains empathy. They are children, Sansa thought. They are silly little girls. Even Eleanor. They've never seen a battle. They've never seen a man die. They know nothing. Their dreams were full of songs and stories, the way hers had been before Joffrey cut her father's head off. Sansa pitied them. Sansa envied them. Sansa had once dreamt of having a sister like Marjorie, beautiful and gentle, with all the world's graces at her command. Arya had been entirely unsatisfactory as far as sisters went. How can I let my sister marry Joffrey? She thought, and suddenly her eyes were full of tears. Marjorie, please, she said. You mustn't. It was hard to get the words out. You mustn't marry him. He's not like he seems. He's not. He'll hurt you. The point I'm making is that a lot of Sansa's arc in King's Landing from the second book onwards is to do with the struggle to preserve her belief. The point of all these other young, innocent people is that they remind Sansa of herself when she came to King's Landing. Cersei and Joffrey and the general trauma Sansa suffers leads her down a path of hating herself in the same way Cersei does. Hating her naivety, partly wanting to shame others who are still like that as a means to project it outwards, and yet she never quite does. And not only is that a triumph of her empathy in the face of her situation, but it is also a triumph of belief in herself. still seeing goodness within herself rather than just something to shame and attack the way everyone makes her internalize. If these other people deserve empathy, even when part of her does feel the opposite, if they still deserve empathy, so does she. I think all of this tells us she did have a lot of loving experiences from her parents growing up, that as much as she might feel self-hatred and shame a lot of the time, there is still a little voice in there saying, no, you deserve more, you are more than they say. At many points it's a very, very faint voice in this story, but it is there. Margaery is a great example for it, because yes, she's older and more politically savvy than Sansa, however she is also literally Sansa's replacement. Margaery's presence literally frees Sansa from Joffrey's torment. She could be an obvious person to project onto, and yet Sansa still tries to stop Margaery, still tries to connect, wants to protect her. It's great. Also, as a side note, it is one of the many examples in the books that show Sansa actually being pretty politically astute, only she's been told so constantly that she's an idiot. She's internalized that to the extent that she then talks herself out of her good instincts. You know, she sees the danger of hot-headed Soloris being made a Kingsguard in order to protect Margaery from Joffrey. Joff might restrain himself for a few turns, perhaps as long as a year. But soon or late, he will show his claws, and when he does, the realm might have a second Kingslayer, and there would be war inside the city, as the men of the Lion and the men of the Rose made the gutters run red. Sansa was surprised Margaery did not see it too. She is older than me, she must be wiser, and her father, Lord Tyrell. He knows what he is doing, surely. I am just being silly. Anyway, I'm running off on tangents. We start book 2 with Sansa wanting Tommen to be told how well he rode, despite knowing it's a lie. Then she has Joffrey and Cersei and the Hound all try to break her goodness. We get to the Battle of Blackwater, soldiers breaching the walls and the sounds of death all around her, and Cersei tells her about the importance of making people fear a queen, and yet Sansa still thinks, even then, if I am ever a queen, I'll make them love me. And not too long after that, we get to a moment with Sansa and the Hound in her chambers. He wants her to sing a song, so she sings about kindness. Soothe the wrath and tame the fury. Teach us all a kinder way. I said earlier that whilst our defences can be bad and can cause some problems, it's often simplistic to see them as a completely bad thing. Sometimes we need them, and also sometimes they have great positives. Sansa's belief in the song probably helps her to preserve some of her kindness and hope, and preserve her humanity in a lot of ways. We shouldn't entirely reject her belief in the song, because I think for Sansa it's also about belief in a better world. You can't create or find a better world if you don't at least partly believe in one, and even for herself, I think it'd be very hard to believe she deserves a life better than the one the Lannisters keep telling her is what she deserves. It'd be hard to believe that without a little hope. Again, that's not to say the defense is a good thing, and we can certainly see how singing a song to the Hound about the kinder way is quite naive and wishful, and it's certainly not to say Sansa comes away perfectly good and healthy from King's Landing, but for everything Sansa suffers, to still come away with a lot of this still intact is heroic, in my opinion. That's one of the things I love about Sansa's story in the early books. It's not about her beating anyone, it's not a story of just defeating the monsters or getting to feel like a badass as a result, because no, the true monster in her story is the trauma it all leaves her with. That's the thing to overcome. That's where her heroism lies, in that more internal battle. The songs may blind her to reality in ways that aren't helpful and that she has to partly let go of, but also, God knows what would have happened to her in King's Landing if she didn't keep singing. Here's a cool conflicted point in Sansa's story with Joffrey. She tells Jane Paul that she had a dream, which was technically a daydream, about the hunt Robert goes off on. She dreams Joffrey being the one to win the hunt and find the White Hart. It's kind of a rosy wishful hope, and yet where in the songs knights never killed the magical beasts, they just went up to them and touched them and did them no harm. But she knew Joffrey liked hunting, especially the killing part. Only animals, though. It's an interesting example of Sansa adjusting her song-like worldview to try and accommodate Joffrey, and in one way that's denial and doing what she can to preserve the perfect rosy view of Joffrey, but in another way, it's also a baby step to maybe seeing things a bit clearer and having a less rigid view. It's interesting to see both of those points within the same experience. It's great writing. I should probably actually mention as well, in terms of all of that, there is a arc you can track across the first book of Sansa's viewpoint becoming more gory or bloody, I suppose, where things like this do start to crop into her daydreams, where Joffrey is actually killing the animals. There's a conversation she has about Sir Gregor's head on a spike. There is the way she's fascinated by the man's death. These things increasingly do start to crop up, and I think that's a sign of her, despite the safety net of her song-like view, still trying to process a lot of the death she's seen and the death of Lady at the same time. There is something important she's exploring there. This is why I love Sansa so much, because I can't make this video concretely saying these are the ways Sansa behaves, these are the ways she feels. I have to talk about everything as a conflict, as this complicated, messy fight between contradictory aspects of herself and so much struggle within her character. I have to talk about it that way because that's how much depth there is to her. But really, this section of the video is an excuse for me to talk about the blood orange. I just wanted to mention it, okay? After Lady's death, Sansa has a slight spat with Arya, who then throws a blood orange that spoils Sansa's dress. Again, a great symbol for the song-like beauty being ruined, and Sansa is just inconsolable about this. She is beyond distressed. When she saw that the stain had bled through onto her underskirt, she began to sob despite herself. She ripped off the rest of her clothes wildly, threw herself into bed, and cried herself back to sleep. I think people can roll their eyes at moments like this and say Sansa is so pathetic, getting worked up over something as small as that when people are literally dying out there. And to that I say yes, she is getting so worked up over something as small precisely because people are dying. Grief can be strange. Sometimes the big things are too big for you to feel in a direct way, so you find smaller things that you can pour those bigger feelings into. Sansa isn't really crying about the dress. It's about what it symbolises. The perfection she came to King's Landing hoping for, all of her childish rosy hopes. The dress symbolises those feelings being torn apart, her innocence ruined. Plus, this was also the dress Cersei gave her when she was betrothed to Joffrey. It had seemed so beautiful then, except Cersei then went and had her direwolf killed. So is she also crying because the Queen isn't the person she had hoped? Also, I can't wear this now in front of Joffrey, it's been ruined. I was supposed to wear it for him. Does the fact I now can't become an insult to them? I can't insult them, especially not Joffrey. I have to be beautiful for Joffrey. I have to keep him from becoming angry. I have to help him become more loving, to teach him a kinder way. Desperately try and preserve my belief that he's a good person. But I can't do that with this dress now, and I'm crying. I feel like it's my fault, not just Arya's, but also Arya's. Everything is a mess, and this dress has suddenly got me pouring all of that out. Did I mention the grief for Lady in that? I don't know what I said, because also there's the grief for Lady's death. Really, I don't know. Some of that is conjecture, but the specifics of what she might be feeling aren't necessarily the point so much as to just illustrate this is how emotions can work. The thing about all of this knights versus monsters, beauty versus ugly approach to understanding the world is that whilst she tries to shut out the ugliness, it is still a part of the process. I said this earlier, she's not pretending it doesn't exist so much as wanting the beauty to prevail over it. The monsters are there in the song specifically to be defeated. Ilyn Payne, though. Sir Ilyn Payne is such an interesting character from Sansa's perspective, and I am a bit stuck on what to think about him. I'm certain there's something more to come in a later book. Sansa is terrified of him, and mentions him constantly in her thoughts or dreams, and I think to her, he symbolises something more than just a monster within this song. He's kind of beyond that. Let me throw some quotes at you. Every time she looked at Sir Ilyn Payne, she shivered. He made her feel as though something dead was slithering over her naked skin. She thought of Sir Ilyn, and how those terrible pale eyes stared pitilessly out of that gaunt, pockmarked face. Once she dreamed it was still her marrying Joff, not Marjorie, and on their wedding night he turned into the headsman Ilyn Payne. There's this dream as well. It was Sir Ilyn Payne she knew, coming for her with ice in his hand, coming to take her head. There was no place to run, no place to hide, no way to bar the door. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and she knew he was just outside, standing there silent with his dead eyes and long-pocked face. That was when she realised she was naked. She crouched down, trying to cover herself with her hands as the door began to swing open, creaking, the point of the greatsword poking through. She woke murmuring, "Please, please, I'll be good, I'll be good, please don't." But there was no one there to hear. You could argue there is something about that dream that does suggest SA, by the way. Not to say Sansa has had that happen, but I think she's been through enough experiences to fear it happening. For which you could interpret this dream in that lens, the sword poking through the door, the snake slithering over her naked skin. Generally, I see these mentions of being naked more as a broader feeling of vulnerability and powerlessness, being very much this object within a larger social game. That tends to be how I see it, but I feel like I should at least mention it for you to make up your mind. That said, there's this horrible moment described with Maester Pycelle, which could be SA, and even if it's not, I think how much you see her dissociating in this moment suggests it's still very traumatic for her. Once, Grand Maester Pycelle came with a box of flasks and bottles to ask if she was ill. He felt her brow, made her undress, and touched her all over while her bedmaid held her down. Just that as a single line in the middle of the chapter, never to be mentioned again. I find that so disturbing. So I feel I should at least mention that for you to make up your mind on it. Personally, I don't much like speculating on SA. I feel like that's a weird thing to do. But I also think that might just be me. Whenever Sansa thinks about death or feels threatened by death, she pictures Ilyn Payne. He seems to be a symbol of death to her, which makes sense. He's the King's Justice. She watched him execute her father. That was an experience too brutal, too traumatic to be part of the song, you know? The monsters are there, but only to be defeated, or to win when the song is later flipped on its head. Knights are meant to save the maids though, no one is really meant to die. It's all more of a song-like, rosy idea of being defeated, bested in glorious combat, you know? Ilyn Payne is like a monster beyond that who threatens to destroy the song itself. From a literary point of view, I think if you ever studied the abject, Ilyn Payne to Sansa is a good example for that. And yeah, I think it becomes difficult for Sansa to process a lot of her feelings around death and grief, around her dad and all of that, because she is so constantly kept in her own state of danger and threat of death. It's hard to process all of the things Ilyn Payne represents to her when he is standing right there as a warning that she too may be executed if she makes one misstep. It's externalized with him. He's more than a monster, he is a genuine threat of annihilation. I think. I don't entirely know what I'm saying, and also she already had strong feelings about Ilyn Payne even before he killed Ned Stark. So maybe there is something to come in the later books. Like, I doubt she'll meet Ilyn Payne again, but I think her feelings about him may develop into a clearer symbolism that means something more. I don't know, I'll let you discuss in the comments about this while I move on to the next section, which is about a different trauma response. When people criticise Sansa as a character, you often see a lot said about her not doing anything, being too passive, never asserting herself, and yeah, that's kinda fair. She is quite a passive character throughout King's Landing, and that's not typically something that makes for dynamic storytelling. Writing a character like this is a hell of a challenge for George R.R. Martin, and I think the show tried to mitigate her passivity by making her extra sassy. The books, I'd say, go for psychological depth. Not to say she's completely passive, by the way, but I think it is largely true in comparison to many other characters, and that's for a very good reason. Trauma. Taking it back to its basics, I'm sure you've heard of fight or flight. They're the commonly known trauma responses, these inbuilt automatic responses we have to situations that feel life-threatening. Your body goes into red alerts and these processes just take over. But there are other trauma responses too. There's also freeze, friend, and flop, possibly even more than that. You don't tend to see people talk about flop. I think it's often bundled in with freeze, but flop is one you see Sansa showing at times, and friend, another important one. Sometimes people call it fawn, but I prefer friend as a word because it's more self-explanatory. Everything we're about to say you might also be able to tie to earlier talk of dissociation. To explain it, friend is often described as pleasing and appeasing, being as nice and amenable as you possibly can in order to avoid and prevent conflict and keep on a dangerous person's good side. People often wrongly attribute this kind of stuff to Stockholm Syndrome. You know, say you're taken captive and there's the constant, very real danger that your captor may just decide to kill you at any moment. In that sort of situation, they're possibly very on edge as well about how they're going to come out of this, how it's all going to end, so being compliant might be a very sensible move, appeasing them, showing them that they can trust you, that they don't need to be as on edge. That might be the very thing to calm them enough to not kill you, or to make them relax, bring their guard down, then provide an opening for you to successfully escape, or keep you alive long enough for others to help. Not that all examples are going to be as extreme or specific as that, obviously. However, Sansa is betrothed to marry Joffrey, a dangerous man. She spends a lot of time attempting to appease him so that his violent rages and malicious desires aren't acted upon. Equally, she tries to appease them so she's not giving Cersei any reasons to be suspicious, certainly not showing any personality or expression, because Sansa is stuck in a place where she's told exactly how she's supposed to be. So like, on the one hand, no wonder she's so passive, because when she isn't, she's beaten or punished. Her expression is arguably beaten out of her. But also, this is a survival instinct. This is turning numb and shutting a lot of it down, most of which will happen unconsciously. How passive Sansa can be is in many ways what makes her chapters so moving, because it's so sad to see. And let's be clear, Sansa is a hostage to the Lannisters completely on her own and without family. What can she do? She can't flee. I mean, she does eventually, but not for a long time can she escape. And an 11-year-old girl can't be expected to fight an older prince, then king, who is trained in combat and surrounded by armed guard in a city full of spies ready to report on her. Plus, all of her maids keep getting changed to prevent her ever forming connections or making schemes. What can she do? Movies have taught us there's something incredibly heroic about a protagonist who will take their torture and imprisonment with a show of resistance, who will make quips against their captors, provoke them, who will never show fear or submission. But were Sansa to do that, she would likely have been killed. I know people will say they need her alive as a hostage, but Joffrey did already kill Ned Stark when they needed him alive, and if she provokes Joffrey too much, there's always the chance his anger will overrule his sense, even just the possibility that he has his Kingsguard hit her a little too hard or a little too often. Although hang on, I just worded that if she provokes Joffrey too much, as though it's her fault Joffrey gets angry. You can see even in me phrasing it that way, that is what Sansa is made to internalize, that it's her fault. Sansa does exactly what she needs to do in order to survive a horrendous situation. They could quite easily have just locked her away in a tower or a cell from which she'd never be able to escape. However, she earns their trust to be allowed to wander where she likes mostly, to be able to visit the Godswood, which is how she is able to communicate with Sodontus, which is how she's eventually able to escape. In fact, part of the reason she's free to do all these things is because the Lannisters incorrectly conclude she's a stupid, compliant little bird. There are a lot of quotes about Sansa wanting to prove how good she is, which we already know plays into her personality anyway, and we also know when she's accused of having traitor's blood, proving that she's good feels vitally important. And again, it's arguably part of that autonomic trauma response. "I'm not like Arya," Sansa blurted. "She has traitor's blood, not me. I'm good. Ask Septa Modane, she'll tell you. I only want to be Joffrey's loyal and loving wife. I won't do any treason. I'll be good, I swear it. I don't have traitor's blood. I don't. I only want to go home." Should she take it to the Queen to prove that she was being good? Again, I'm not arguing all of this is sensible, smart things to do. Arguably smarts doesn't even come into it because a lot of this is unconscious trauma response, and when smarts do come into it, I think despite her blinkered viewpoint, you can see a level of skill and intelligence to her actions. For example, after Ned is arrested, Sansa is manipulated by a very manipulative Cersei and quickly realises that she has to be smart about how to try and save her father. She can't just argue that he's not a traitor actually, because that makes her look treasonous. What can she do instead? Sansa argues for the virtue of mercy. She says, yes, my dad is a traitor, however he was probably tricked by the evil Stannis and surely regrets his actions. He does need to be punished, but we can also be merciful. In many ways, this is the culmination of her conflict around Joffrey, because she sees him as her one desperate hope of saving Ned Stark. If she went to him and pleaded for mercy, she was certain he'd listen. He had to listen. Joff would need to punish father, the lords would expect it, but perhaps she could send him back to Winterfell, or exile him to one of the free cities across the Narrow Sea. It would only have to be for a few years. By then, she and Joffrey would be married. Once she was queen, she could persuade Joff to bring her father back and grant him a pardon. It's childish, it's wishful, and of course people would prefer her to stand up all brave and show loyalty to the Starks in her words. However, were Joffrey not actually Joffrey, she might have succeeded here. Perhaps. There is some sense the downfall is her reluctance to not see Joffrey for who he is, to desperately hope there is still a kinder way inside of him that her romanticised vision of love will tease out. You feel the desperation here. We'll also mention that she does show a good level of rhetoric here as well. I won't read all of it, and you can feel a childishness still in the way she talks, but it's also very well argued. "Do you deny your father's crime?" Lord Baelish asked. "No, my lords." Sansa knew better than that. "I know he must be punished. All I ask is mercy. I know my lord father must regret what he did. He was King Robert's friend and he loved him. You all know he loved him. He never wanted to be hanged until the king asks for him. They must have lied to him. Lord Renly or Lord Stannis or somebody. They must have lied. His leg was broken," Sansa replied eagerly. "It hurt ever so much. Maester Pycelle was giving him milk of the poppy, and they say that milk of the poppy fills your head with clouds. Otherwise, he would never have said it." To be 11 years old and stand before an entire court and manage all of this is genuinely impressive. But Joffrey is Joffrey, and this is the moment she finally realises that she can't deny it any longer. Ned's death completely alters her feelings, for which, those of you who do want a less passive Sansa, she does then try fighting. She wondered how she could have ever thought him handsome. His lips were as soft and red as the worms you found after rain, and his eyes were vain and cruel. "I hate you," she whispered. To which she is beaten. And she remains defiant at first, but it is made clear she will continue to be beaten. She even gets hurt a lot regardless, because Joffrey is unpredictable and malicious, but she quickly learns she is hurt a lot less when she doesn't provoke him. The Hound provides her with the advice that sticks. "Save yourself some pain, girl, and give him what he wants." "What? What does he want? Please tell me." "He wants you to smile and smell sweet and be his lady love," the Hound rasped. "He wants to hear you recite all your pretty little words the way the scepter taught you. He wants you to love him and fear him." So, if Sansa feels under pressure to prove she is good, especially when she's secretly scheming to escape, she is also under pressure to behave in a very rigid, objectified manner at all times. She is made to be the little bird. She is forced into it while also being told that's all she actually is. She's stupid and pathetic and can do nothing but spout phrases. And as we've said, a part of her comes to believe that. The danger would be if she starts to feel she deserves the treatment she suffers. When she also unwittingly played a hand in her father's arrest and the deaths of a lot of the Starks, guilt could feed into that belief. And that's exactly where it would become difficult to maintain hope, to risk, to dare trying to escape. That's where you might start to see the cage as a home. There's a real psychological horror in that. And as a quick point, it's fantastic writing how this idea of the beautiful song being ruined, someone spoiling it like Arya, how all of that gradually contorts until she starts to feel she's the one spoiling it. It's her fault things can't be beautiful. It's her fault Joffrey gets mad. I'm the one causing these things. Despite internalizing that on a lot of levels, she does never give up hope of escaping. Alright, we'll quickly mention dissociation again to point out how naturally that would fit for a situation where she isn't allowed to express her feelings at all. Sometimes she's even afraid to think them internally in case some of her actual emotion shows on her face. How awful a situation that is, you know? But it means we do get lots of obvious dissociative examples, the clearest being when she is taken to see her father's head. Sansa looked at it calmly, not seeing it at all. And there is further description that links to the same look without seeing phrase that Jaime uses to describe his own dissociation. There's the general numbness we see in a lot of situations, and there's also the altering or loss of memory. That's what we're going to discuss next, but generally this section of the video was meant to set out her trauma response throughout a lot of King's Landing, whilst also highlighting that she doesn't become trapped within it. She pleases and appeases, yet still schemes to escape. When she first gets a secret note from Sodontus, she considers taking it to the Queen to prove how good she is being. She fears it's a trick, and yet she changes her mind. She goes to visit the Godswood. Her faint hope of something better wins out over that fear, and the fact she continues to hold fast to that decision, to the plan of escape, even when her stress increases, that is a testament to Sansa. Brienne talks in the story about Catelyn having a woman's kind of strength, not battle bravery, but a different kind of patience and courage, and I think Sansa shows all of that in abundance here. Also, by the way, to come out of her experiences with Joffrey, mostly seeing him for who he is. First seeing him only as a perfect prince, then as a monster, and then eventually kind of as a pathetic boy. "He called me boy," Joffrey said peevishly, sounding younger than his years. So the king had decided to play gallant today. Sansa was relieved. He had never sounded more like a stupid little boy. Sansa touched her lips to the metal, thinking that she would kiss any number of swords sooner than Joffrey. For everything he puts her through, to come away recognising this about him, whilst also knowing how powerful and terrifying he can be. That is a strength. That shows her growing understanding of nuance in place of the black and white, beauty versus ugliness, you know? That's great, but now, yes, let's jump to a quick section about memory. I suspect there are story, possibly magic-based reasons for some of her memory troubles in the books. You know, I don't actually know these books that well. I only read them for the first time about a year or two ago. Technically, I've only read them once, but I've just dipped into chapters again for the sake of these videos. Someone smarter than me can speculate about her memory. However, I also think sometimes when people talk about the kind of altered memory situations, there's a tendency for people to see it like Sansa is going mad. Or if anyone misremembers things, they're going mad. That's the trope in fiction. Whatever going mad means. But, everybody misremembers things. Memory is hard, and our objective perception is so regularly affected by our subjective feelings, especially if it's old memories with a lot of emotion behind that literally have no evidence beyond whatever is in our head. Sansa misremembers the Joffrey-Micah situation, for example. Arya's friends that Sansa ends up thinking attacked Joffrey first, when actually it was the opposite. Joffrey attacked him. I think that's quite a simple example of what's an easier or safer way to interpret the memory in her mind. Arguably, you could say that's quite similar to her interpreting that, you know, father simply wasn't thinking straight when he tried to stop her marrying Joffrey. However, even if this can be common, especially with children, you don't write something like memory troubles into a story unless it means more, do you? And I think the example with the Hound is a bigger example. Before he leaves King's Landing during the Battle of Blackwater, the Hound goes to Sansa's chamber and forces her to sing him a song. Sansa misremembers this later on and thinks he kissed her. He'd come to her the night of the battle, stinking of wine and blood. He kissed me, and threatened to kill me, and made me sing him a song. He had come to Sansa in the darkness as the green fire filled the sky. He took a song and a kiss, and left me nothing but a bloody cloak. Twice that's mentioned. The fact I think such a big deal is made about it suggests it's going to have some greater relevance in the story. I have no idea what. I'm really intrigued what people could comment though. But from a character position, I tend to think of this in the sense that the Hound would be super confusing to Sansa in that scene. He goes to her chamber drunk, offers to rescue her, then demands her to sing, gets angered by her not looking at him, throws her onto the bed, threatens to kill her, and then cries and leaves right after she finishes singing. What answer do you come to about what that experience was? Why was the Hound there? What was he doing? We're not going to get into the depths of Sandor's psychology today. The point is, for a child, this is really confusing. Is he a knight coming to rescue me? Is he a monster coming to attack me? Is he both? Does he even know? I've had all these strange encounters with Sandor before, where he clearly seems to care about me in some kind of way, more than he does other people, but what does any of that actually mean? And let's not play this down. Sandor Clegane is an incredibly strong, dangerous man. He yanks her close for what she thinks is going to be a kiss, and quite possibly may have been. For a moment she thought he meant to kiss her. He was too strong to fight. She closed her eyes, wanting it to be over, but nothing happened. And then he shoves her down upon the bed and draws a dagger to her throat. Regardless of the reality of anything that's happened, that is more than enough trauma and threat of SA. Even if Sandor never intended it, and that is an if, Sansa would probably still fear it in that moment. She most definitely fears for her life here. So pulling all of this traumatic, confusing experience together, I think interpreting Sandor as wanting a kiss and a song makes sense as a way she might interpret it. Not just because it's less traumatic to think about that way, although she doesn't rework the whole experience into some nightly moment of pure romance. Like, she's still clear in her memory that he threatens to kill her, but it is less overwhelming that way, and also makes more sense in its motives now. Sandor wanted a kiss. That's easier to comprehend than the confusing mix of different emotions he displays where she has no idea what he wanted. Again, I think people could argue that SA did actually happen here, and Sansa is dissociating from that. Perhaps it's my reluctance to speculate, but I don't see that being the case. Absolutely the memory troubles are going to mean more than just that in the story, otherwise George wouldn't draw so much attention to it, but from a psychological perspective, this is how I'd most likely interpret it all. And that's kind of as much as I can say here, so we're going to move on now to a big talk about love and romance, then we'll get to her time in the Eyrie, and then we might discuss where Sansa's story will go next in the books. This is a section to talk about the struggle of Sansa constantly being put into situations that are almost like love triangles, except she doesn't want them, and it's actually interesting, and it's not just played for base drama. Love triangles, or a rivalrous love triangle to be more specific, being the fiction trope where two people are vying for the love of someone that kind of loves them both and can't decide who to go for. The sort of situations a lot of romance stories go buck wild for, and I'm sure George Martin is deliberately wanting to pull that trope apart via Sansa, because there are a lot of them here with Sansa. The first triangle, which isn't a love triangle by the way, it's not a hate triangle either, but it is a triangle of sorts. Well, it's also a square. Sansa, the Hound, Sodontus, and then kind of Joffrey. So at this point in the story, Sansa hates Joffrey, but is still betrothed to him, and it's a little like he's the dragon keeping the princess locked in the tower, whereas the Hound and Sodontus are positioned as two very different people attempting to protect or rescue her. Sodontus is the once knight, now a fool, who tries to stop Joffrey from punishing Sansa by alleviating the situation with humour, as well as outright working with Littlefinger to help her escape. And the Hound is not a knight, but kind of one. He does nothing to stop Joffrey or the other guards hurting Sansa, but he doesn't hit her himself except a few situations. He does help her get out of the lie when she tells Joffrey she can't punish a man on his name day. He brings her his cloak when she has been stripped. He helps her get back into the castle after she's been out, and most notably he saves her from the rioting crowd. Other examples like that, culminating in his drunken offer to take her away to King's Landing. Is he a good person? His good good actions don't really add up to much there. But is there some level of care? I think so. Sansa doesn't really understand his feelings, and her own are very mixed about him, but some part of her does appreciate him. What makes this relevant to talk about is that Sansa was raised on stories all about knightly figures who rescue beautiful maids to protect them, and in all of the stories, the girls fall in love with their protectors. That is how it's supposed to be in the songs, therefore that's how she thinks it's supposed to be in real life. And then there is kind of that cultural expectation placed upon her. With Sodontus it's much more obvious, because they call each other after Florian and John Keel, two lovers from the songs. He is constantly asking her for a kiss, or trying to press one upon her. "Give your Florian a little kiss now. Kiss for luck." Sansa dodged the wet groping lips, kissed him lightly on an unshaven cheek. Sodontus planted a slobbery kiss on her ear. Dontus leaned close and kissed her again. Sansa is a vulnerable girl stuck in a position of trying to maintain boundaries with Sodontus despite the possible unspoken expectation that she should fall in love with her rescuer. It's an awkward situation of depending on his help, being genuinely grateful for that, caring for him as well, seeing him as a mostly good person, but not loving him, not wanting him to confuse her care for love, and trying not to upset him with her boundaries. You don't want him too upset because you still need his help, but you don't want him getting the wrong idea. Also, you're a child who barely understands his motivations. It's a bit of a tightrope she's forced into walking here, made no easier by the fact, yes, she is a young girl raised on ideas of knights and rescuing fair maidens, so there's a slight confusion of, am I supposed to fall in love with him? Should I be trying to? I don't think I want to, but I don't quite know. I think she generally sees Sodontus as harmless. We could debate his motivations, obviously, but I think she mostly learns how to maintain her boundaries there with him. The Hound, however, he is less harmless and much more dangerous. He is genuinely horrible to Sansa in a lot of moments, but he also feels something towards her. I do think there might be a muddled confusion between acceptance and love with Sandor. Sansa is the only person who attempts to show him empathy and to see him as something other than just a dog, which mostly results in him making it absolutely clear just how beastly and dog-like he is, reveling in upsetting her, but occasionally you get the faintest sense he's taken her care to heart and considered, maybe she is someone who can see my humanity, and then has he mistakenly mixed that up with ideas of romance or love or possession. You know, it's my belief he did pull her in to kiss her, only when he saw she wasn't looking at his face, he saw that as a sign of her seeing him as ugly, that she doesn't accept him on a deeper level, that she still sees him as this brute, and therefore he reacted by throwing her onto the bed, pulling a knife, and threatening to kill and possibly commit SA. The point being how easily Sansa unwittingly gets pulled into a hurricane of emotions and own insecurities and sensitivity that she can't possibly understand, being judged upon how she reacts to all of this stuff, upon how accepting she is towards him or not. And again, made even more complicated because some part of her does feel a level of affection or care or something towards him. I don't think romantic at all, but Sandor Clegane possibly hopes it is. It's also caught up in ideas of a direwolf lady, with parallels made between the two. For example, Sandor saying, "A dog can smell a lie, you know," where earlier in the same chapter we get, Sansa found herself thinking of Lady again. She could smell out falsehood. Navigating a world where you've been thrust into this place where so many people make massive expectations of you, objectify you, and somehow you're not only supposed to figure out all of their feelings and sensitivity and their worries of rejection and acceptance, manage their expectations, and keep yourself safe, but also try to figure out what you want independently of what everyone else is trying to use you for. For example, does Sansa want to go to the Eyrie with Littlefinger? Obviously she wants to escape King's Landing. Should she feel warmth towards her rescuer? More objective I can say no, he's dangerous, you can't trust him, but Sansa has to figure that out while being used and while depending on him at the same time. It's super complex. No wonder she can feel paralysed, you know? And because I know I'll get comments about it, I'll say, fine, there is a power in all of that Sansa can wield. However, having that power and that situation thrust upon you without any idea of how to wield it or what you even want, that's dangerous. You know, a flamethrower isn't much of a power if you don't know how to use it and risk burning yourself, is it? We then get a triangle of Sansa, Tyrion, Littlefinger. I talked about this a bit in my video comparing Sansa in the books and the show, and I was a little harsh on Tyrion in that video because it was from Sansa's perspective. And I didn't even discuss it much in my Tyrion video. You know, I one day want to remake that one. I think that was the most rushed character analysis. I can definitely do a better job there. However, to again consider things from Sansa's perspective, I am aware a lot of people dislike Sansa for the way she treats Tyrion. You see a lot of people complaining about it. She is cold to him in the books. She never opens up. Let's be clear, she doesn't reject him. There's this horrible situation of her being told what her duty is to her new husband and feeling powerless to go against that. If Tyrion really wanted to, he could have forced himself upon her. He recognises she is a child, and yet he also becomes aroused and he advances and only draws back after he sees her reaction. Let's not put a gloss over that fact, you know, just because the show tries to make him look noble. Thrown into an arranged marriage with each other, this is another very dangerous situation for Sansa. And yes, whilst he is mostly perfectly pleasant towards her, we also know how incredibly vindictive Book Tyrion can be, how violent and how hurt he can be by rejection. From Sansa's perspective, how does she know she can trust him to remain pleasant? How does she know a day won't come where her lack of affection grates on him and changes his approach? You know, some of his pleasantness is based on the expectation that if he's nice, she will open up and accept him someday, but if she never does, how does she know Tyrion isn't pulling the same courteous trick that Joffrey did? All Sansa is towards Tyrion is distant. She finds him ugly. Yes, that's true, but she never comments on it. She is never rude or harsh or showing contempt. She even remarks on several occasions that he is kind to her. What Sansa is mostly is just numbed, in a suppressed state around him, and I think for people to interpret her fear and partial trauma response there like some snobby, mean rejection of another character, like some mean girl setup, I think that's completely to misunderstand Sansa. It says a lot about the ways we thrust that archetype onto people. Courtesy is a lady's armour, that's the phrase Septa Mordain taught Sansa. Keeping herself repressed and distant and being nothing but empty duty has been an important part of her defence mechanism for good or bad. She's not about to completely throw that out of the window the second her new husband isn't treating her awfully. You know, you don't just undo trauma like that, especially when he is also a Lannister and you fear he might report your secrets to Cersei or to Joffrey or to Tywin. So Sansa owes Tyrion absolutely nothing. Yeah, all of that is painful for Tyrion. Of course it hurts Tyrion to not feel accepted by her. However, for one, love and acceptance are not the same thing, and two, there's not much she can do about Tyrion's hopes there. It's another difficult example of a vulnerable girl being vulnerable and having expectations thrust upon her by a grown man who might take rejection to heart. All of this is relevant to say, I think, because all of these not love triangles serve to completely tear down Sansa's hopes of love and romance. She, at first, is confusing ideas of love and rescue to the extent she comes to feel hopeful about Willis Tyrell in the books. A man she's never met, a man she is slightly disappointed to learn is crippled, however she gets excited about the possibility of being whisked away to Highgarden, hoping it's not like King's Landing until Sodontus tells her, "It's only your claim they mean to wed." And he's right. This desire people have for her, is that a power she can wield? Surely this is more like a mule to be bartered without any of her own say in the matter, you know? It's paralysing, and I suspect could make her quite cynical or suspicious of any possible genuine romantic affection. And where this does will leave her despairing and out of touch with concepts like loyalty and affection and an ordinary common kindness, Littlefinger then has an answer for her. "You must miss your father terribly, I know. Lord Eddard was a brave man, honest and loyal, but quite a hopeless player. He brought the seed to his mouth with the knife. In King's Landing there are two sorts of people, the players and the pieces. And I was a piece. She dreaded the answer. Yes, but don't let that trouble you. You're still half a child. Every man's a piece to start with, and every maid as well. Even some who think they are players. Is something Littlefinger tells her after she escapes King's Landing. She began hoping for genuine love and adventure, then saw herself as a victim searching for someone who will love and rescue her, and then increasingly realising that it's her claim people want. There aren't just the monsters who want to abuse and the knights who want to save you, there are also a great many complex people who might want something else from you, or might save you but for their own reasons, in which case how do you seek help from anyone without being manipulated in exchange? Again, let's remember, Littlefinger has only half rescued her. One problem we have here is the question, what does Sansa want? She first wanted Joffrey, then wanted to escape King's Landing, now what? What does she truly want from life? Because being stuck in King's Landing, she had zero headspace to think clearly about that. Now, in the Eyrie, we do see her beginning to process things. We see her building a castle in the snow, something she pours immense effort and time into, building what she realises is a model of Winterfell. Soon, her gloves and her boots were crusty white, her hands were tingling, and her feet were soaked and cold, but she did not care. The castle was all that mattered. You don't go to those lengths unless something more is going on here, and I think it's pretty similar to the stuff that happens in play therapy. She is symbolically working through all of her feelings about her lost home, a place both literally destroyed and metaphorically in the sense that all of her family and her old life are gone. This is her grieving for it, trying to honour it, remember it, rebuild a version of those happy experiences, whilst also getting to feel angry and hurt at the fact that proves impossible. No matter how hard she tries, she can't get the castle right. And even when she comes close, Robert appears to knock it down. She becomes absolutely furious with him about that because, like the Blood Orange before, it is more than a castle in the snow to her. It represents everything. This scene probably suggests what she wants is home or her family. That's the most obvious thing she would seek, but it might not prove an end in itself. I think she's likely to want a space where she isn't dependent on someone else's safety. I think she's likely to be mistrustful of her rescuers, but I really don't know. I would hope there is still a little dreamy part of her that holds to the idea of teaching the world a kinder way, of wanting to still sing into the world, but whatever she wants, Littlefinger has a lesson. You can only get what you want by becoming the player. And in many ways, yeah, that's probably a good thing considering her situation. She is alone, she cannot trust Littlefinger, and she may need to use cunning to protect herself. In a way, I suppose this is an evolution of the appeasing and pleasing role she had to play with Joffrey, because this time she is more awake, let's say. On the surface, pleasing and appeasing Littlefinger, letting him think she is a piece in his game, whilst potentially taking advantage of that when the right moment comes. And from a character point of view, that's quite powerful when you think about it. To take the thing and the behaviour she did that she felt bad about, that people told her she was a stupid little bird for, to take even her trauma response and turn it into something more of a positive and something with more control and awareness. And Sansa can be very savvy. Tyrion admires her ability in King's Landing to make use of small talk. She becomes increasingly perceptive at understanding people. Also, she is very astute when it comes to using fashion to her advantage, what certain outfits might convey subtly and symbolically. I like that George bothered to include those kind of elements in the story. She's increasingly becoming a leader in the Vale who the Maester goes to for advice. She makes orders of various servants and guards to address political and practical problems. She's still 13, but she's growing. Sansa will need to be a player in the game. However, I can't also help questioning whether or not this is a road she wants to lose herself down. It is essential for her survival right now, but will it always be. Both her parents were never Littlefinger types. Whilst they were killed in the end, yes, both were highly respected figures that many remained loyal to even after their deaths. I wouldn't use their deaths to conclude that everything about their less scheming approach was wrong. Sansa might one day need to use similar skills as them in order to evoke the kind of loyalty in others that Littlefinger's approach could never achieve. In A Feast for Crows, Merlyn sings from the dungeon while Sansa reflects on how she always used to yearn for singers to come to Winterfell when she was young. But that was when she was a little girl, and foolish. She was a maiden now, 3 and 10, and flowered. All her nights were full of song, and by day she prayed for silence. I don't know how literally or metaphorically we're meant to take that line. Is it literally just her nights are full of song because Merlyn keeps singing from his dungeon and she wants him to stop because it wraps her with guilt? Or is this a more poignant line? Is this a metaphorical link to the song that Sansa has been singing? Does this suggest her turning away from it? You know, she does feel some guilt about what happens to Merlyn. He was an awful man. He forced himself upon countless women and tried to do the same to Sansa. Sansa also feels some guilt about Lysa's death, and is most definitely horrified by Sodontus's. But Littlefinger, who causes the demise of all 3 of these, effectively tells her, what does it matter? All these people were pieces. You couldn't trust them anyway. You have to use them as pieces, otherwise they will use you. If we didn't kill Sodontus, he would have turned you in. If we didn't kill Lysa, she would have killed you. Arguably, this is correct, but again, to what extent does this advice start to become damaging? It's time we discussed her relationship to Robin Arryn. I know he's technically Robert Arryn, but I'm calling him Robin for simplicity, and to Harry the Heir. What's immediately obvious about both of those relationships is that it does reverse Sansa's experiences now. She is seeing them as the pieces and herself as the player. They are using Robert Arryn to keep Littlefinger as Lord Protector. They are lying to him, subduing him, arranging things so that when he dies, which he may be forced into doing at some point, they will have a good claim to the Vale if she marries Harry the Heir. That is super interesting when you compare it against everything I've previously said about Sansa. Like if we compared the ways Book 1 Sansa tried to act all parental in persuading Arya, we see she is much more effective at that with Robin now. She is older, she is more cunning, she is much more like an actual parental figure to him. Generally, she can get Robin Arryn to do what she wants, but if we compare the way she was about Tommen to how she is with Robin, then it's complicated. At times, it is touching. There are moments where Sansa shows empathy towards a boy that no doubt is incredibly stressful to her to manage. I like this moment when she needs to persuade Robin to travel down the mountain. He is afraid, she thought, and with good reason. Since his lady mother had fallen, the boy would not even stand upon a balcony, and the way from the Eyrie to the Gates of the Moon was perilous enough to daunt anyone. That's not, oh, for God's sake, is there anything this kid isn't afraid of? It's not mocking him or doing as Cersei did, it's understanding, yeah, he's got good reason to feel the way he does. There are moments where she does show care. She still gets things wrong, she's not totally caring and not totally good at handling Robin, but she is attempting to do what she thinks is best for him a lot of the time. That said, she's not stupid. She's aware Littlefinger is hoping or even planning for Robin to die at some point. Where Sansa felt horrified about Sodontus's death and partly guilty about Lysa and Merlyn, is Littlefinger changing her? Will she be horrified if Robin dies? Will she play a part in it? Whilst I say she's doing what she thinks is best for Robin a lot of the time, it's not like she's really helping him to grow or develop as a person. It's more what's easiest to calm him down and control him. Maybe from her point at her age, she does kind of think she's doing what's best for him, but is she really? Because yeah, a lot of her interactions with Robin are manipulation. She starts to have a smile like Peter's that doesn't reach her eyes. She recognises Robin is seeking another maternal presence with a level of confusion in terms of all the descriptions about her bosom, whether she is a mum or someone for Robin to marry. You know, this is a little boy who has feelings he doesn't understand, and Sansa is taking advantage of that confusion exactly as happens to her. And it's kinda heartbreaking. Not only for how sorry I feel for Robin, but for how Sansa might be changing here. Her empathy is tested by how difficult he can be. We see Sansa thinking things of Robin like, "You are such a little fool," which is no doubt what Cersei thought of Sansa. Is there even a deliberate link between Sansa being called Little Bird and him being called Sweet Robin? How much is Sansa seeking to nurture this innocent boy and how much to manipulate him? He is the piece and she is the player. It's a conflict that is yet to reach a resolution. The Winter sample chapter again shows Sansa kinda trying to find the good in Robin, even if it's a bit forced. He does have pretty hair. If the gods are good and he lives long enough to wed, his wife will admire his hair, surely. That much she will love about him. Which is a line I think that shows her being willfully blind to Robin's approaching death, by the way. Plus, let's add in the complication that if Robin did live and grow, he could at some point become quite dangerous and unpredictable. I should at least mention the fact that there is some reversal in the kind of relationship Sansa had with Joffrey and now has with Robin. Different people and different dynamics, but I think there is potentially something in her relationship with Robin that is helping her process her experience with Joffrey, or kind of come to terms and make sense of it. Potentially. Look, we could discuss Harry the Heir, the guy in the books who would inherit the Eyrie if Robin dies, that Littlefinger has tasked Sansa with seducing in disguise as Elaine Stone so that she can marry, have a claim to the Eyrie, and then reveal herself again as Sansa Stark. Also, Littlefinger says that's the plan anyway. I quite like seeing Sansa in those scenes with Harry, seeing some genuine wit from her, but also the childlike fun she still has with Miranda, seeing her generally growing in confidence. But I think discussing that could be repetitive. The general point is that Sansa's story now has her teetering on the edge of becoming like Littlefinger. And whilst that's not all bad, it could be in the wrong situations. This was the girl who sang about a kinder way and believed in beauty. Here she is technically an accomplice, or at least willfully blind to a plan of murdering a child. And we can argue it's politically necessary, I suppose, in this darker world, sure, but that doesn't mean it won't have some lasting effect on the kind of person Sansa might become. So who do I think she'll become? Let's actually talk about it properly, instead of me just sort of skirting around the edges of making a point. Alright, well, if you want the theory-style prediction bit first, then we'll start with what I was told by Quinn from the channel Quinn the GM. This was originally going to be a collaboration with him. We talked a load, but things got in the way in the end. Check out his channel anyway, it's great. He knows far more than me about the Song of Ice and Fire. But he pointed out to me in one of Arya's chapters in A Storm of Swords, the character the Ghost of Highheart makes various prophecies, including the Red Wedding, Balon Greyjoy's death, and she says this: "I dreamt of a maid at a feast with purple serpents in her hair, venom dripping from her fangs. And later, I dreamt that maid again, slaying a savage giant in a castle built of snow." Quinn suggested to me that the maid is almost certainly Sansa, whose jewels supposedly contains the venom to kill Joffrey at the Purple Wedding feast. If so, she will slay a giant, and he pointed out the Baelish house sigil is a giant. Which immediately made me think again of the scene where Sansa is building Winterfell in the snow, because Littlefinger literally steps into that castle built of snow. And then Robin comes along pretending to be a giant, smashes the castle until Sansa gets so angry she rips the head off his doll, places it atop a broken branch at the gatehouse of her castle, and then Littlefinger says, "If the tales be true, that's not the first giant to end up with its head on Winterfell's walls." So that feels to me like two pretty solid hints to suggest Sansa will kill Littlefinger, and that it'll happen at Winterfell. Beyond that though, more character-wise, what can we say about Sansa? Well, break it down to its basics, and I think Sansa's story is the same thing it always was. It's beauty versus ugliness. Originally that meant something more superficial, but not anymore. It became a great internal struggle of her own beauty to win out over her own darkness. These books are filled to the brim with characters who have been through trauma, often in their youth, like so many of them. And most of them get caught in a cycle repeating the trauma or enacting it upon others. I touched on that loosely in the way Cersei treats Sansa. There's also the way Cersei's relationship in the books with the character Taena Merryweather is largely her means to become like Robert Baratheon, treat someone else the way he treated her, and in general she does slowly start becoming very much like Robert in a very tragic experience that could have had the potential for Cersei to process something. I think there are bigger examples than that, but that's quite a nice specific one, because now we have Sansa and Robin with a similar kind of setup. It was all very well me earlier saying that Sansa resisted becoming Cersei 2.0 throughout her time in King's Landing, but that was when her focus was absorbed in survival and escape, and she had only fleeting relationships with anyone she might be able to project onto. But now she has Robin, who is a young, foolish boy, but also an incredibly stressful one to be tasked with looking after for most of your waking moments. One that does test Sansa's patience and empathy much more, and again, whilst he is definitely different, Robin is a child kind of like Joffrey in various ways. Stuck with Robin for long enough, does he become a situation where Sansa enacts her trauma upon him, where she's reversing the role, treating him the way Joffrey treated her? Obviously not to the same extent. No, Joffrey was incredibly cruel and sadistic, but in smaller ways. And even symbolically, Sansa ripped the head off Robin's favourite doll and stuck it on a makeshift spike. Is that not literally what Joffrey did to Sansa with Ned Stark's head? There is a messy, ugly side of Sansa somewhere there that we get fleeting glances of in the books. Something that, lost in enough shame, could grow and develop and increasingly take over, or it could be something she processes. Robin could be a means to understand and to rekindle empathy, not just for him, but for herself. What if even in Robin there is something worth nurturing and preserving more than his pretty hair? And if so, what might it mean for Sansa to be able to see that? In a world of characters enacting and repeating trauma, I think Sansa is super important to show that you can grow beyond it, that we aren't all doomed to the abuses we've suffered. It's super difficult, it's not at all straightforward, and you might feel lost and struggle along the way, but you can. Personally, much more than getting to defeat zombies, that's the sort of dream of spring I'm hoping for, that more internal one. So yes, she's not going to come out of all of this as naive and straightforward as she began the books, but her song still meant something important. Wanting to teach the world the kinder way still means something. I've made a big thing out of her singing one religious song in one scene, but I think it is symbolic. One day, Sansa may find herself with power, she may even find herself back at Winterfell, and if so, what will she do with her power? You can't just make the entire world kind, no, but that deeper motivation there to try and make the world a better place, to actually be attempting that. That's kind of the big thing here. She began the books just hoping to see everything as beautiful and perfect when actually it isn't. Life forever falls short of your dreams, but that doesn't mean you can't create beauty. And she played at rebuilding Winterfell in the snow. She may have to rebuild it in reality if she does go back to Winterfell. That's what seems to be the case. It won't take her back to the way things were before. Winterfell has burned. Everyone she knew there from before is gone, but can it be a means to at least create something better? Whatever that might mean. This whole set of books has been endless, pointless games of power that achieve very little and cause untold suffering to thousands upon thousands of common people. Even Sansa's best friend, Jane Poole, is technically a common person who has suffered awful cruelty for the sake of someone else's game of power. I can't help feeling, should Sansa discover about Jane, that could become a key part of her motivation, and that could be satisfying. The character who began the books looking superficially down on the small folk coming to care for them. I've gotten quite passionate here, I think, but can this internal battle win out and have her still wanting to sing and to nurture? Sure, she will have taken things from Cersei and Littlefinger, but hopefully that again is chewing the fat and spitting out the gristle rather than losing herself to it. And anyway, as much as I've poked fun about singing of kindness to the Hound and calling it naive, if the many theories about the Gravedigger are correct, then perhaps the Hound did find his peace. Perhaps Sansa was absolutely right there. An internal beauty can win out over that ugliness. At the end of the day, the books are gearing towards a giant world-ending threat, or humanity-ending threat, let's say. For the whole battle with the White Walkers to actually matter at all, we first have to be reminded that humanity is actually worth saving. That there is beauty and goodness, that it isn't all death and greed and horror, for which I think Sansa is the perfect character to say, yes, there is something worth saving. I don't even mean that in a naive, innocent way anymore, because I've seen just as much darkness as anyone, and yet there is still something more. Again, even if we don't actually get to see the spring, at least we'll be able to dream of it. And if we don't ever actually get the book titled A Dream of Spring, then we'll wait 2 billion years until someone resurrects George. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a long one to make. I still feel like there's so much I didn't get into, and I'm really intrigued what people comment. I don't know if this is so big, nobody knows what to comment, but I really hope you enjoyed this. Like the video if you did. Subscribe, check out my other character analysis videos, maybe even support me on Patreon. But otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Grace, Kellyanne Davidson, Luke Orr, Michael Gallagher, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.